Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a chilly night here in our campus in the Lakeside Theater at the University of Essex. The lecture tonight is the first in a series of special events which celebrate the excellence in research undertaken by our recently appointed professors from world-leading academic departments with international reputations who talk about their research, exchange ideas, and I hope inspire you. Essex is the UK's top university for social science, and we're ranked 9th in the UK for the overall quality of our research. Sociology at Essex is ranked 24th in the world according to the latest QS World University Rankings by subject. Research excellence is indeed at the heart of our work at Essex, and we have established a global reputation for the last 50 years for the high quality of our work. And this year is especially important for us as we celebrate our 50th anniversary. And over the forthcoming year, we will hear from professors in the departments of government, sociology, literature, film and theater studies, history, mathematical sciences, health and human sciences, and the Institute for Social and Economic Research. Now, I'd like to introduce Pam to you. She obtained her BA in history and a PhD from the University of Cambridge and came to Essex in 1997. She teaches and researches across the areas of social history, social policy, and criminology, and has recently presented 2 BBC Two series, Shop Girls, The True Story of Life Behind the Counter, and Servants, The True Story of Life Below the Stairs. You will hear more about this as Pam draws on her recent BBC series to explore what is gained as well as lost in translating this historical research during her lecture. During the past few months, Pam's been involved in a number of events to mark the 40th anniversary of the 1974 Working Women's Charter and to call for a new one for the 2015 UK general election. She recently gave a TEDx talk here in this theater as part of our 50th anniversary, making the case for this charter. Pam's also the author of Shop Girls, which she co-authored with Annabel Hobley, and which accompanies her latest series, and Bad Girls in Britain, in which she explores the part played by domestic service training in the reform of delinquent, destitute, and neglected girls. She's also co-authored and co-edited a number of other books. She's working on a new research project called Aftercare with crime historians Barry Godfrey and Heather Shore, which investigates the long-term impact of 19th and early 20th century youth justice interventions, and another project on Going Digital. Pam is the principal grant holder for a series of creative, hands-on workshops helping humanities doctoral students to develop digital research skills, and this was awarded £60,000 from the AHRC. Pam's also worked as a youth justice consultant, and a lay member of Suffolk Family Justice Council, and is on the executive committee of the Social History Society and an external examiner at the University of Lancaster. She recently joined the editorial board of the Journal of Contemporary British History and served as Dean of the Graduate School here at Essex from 2009 to 2013. I'd like you to join me now in welcoming Professor Pam Cox, who will talk this evening about translating history for television. Professor Cox.
I will start when I find my talk, which was here and is not here now. Excuse me 1 second. It's not intentional. That was so intentional. I'm sorry.
I can't help the sleight of hand on that one.
Never work with a magician executive dean. Oh my lord. It's okay. Okay, well, good evening, and I'm sorry that you were waiting a long time in the cold. Thank you, Todd, for the introduction, but not for stealing my talk. There are a few moments in your life when people from different eras of your life are present in the same room, and this is one of those moments, and it's really rather wonderful. I remember the other time when that happened to me was at my wedding 10 years ago. My lovely husband in the front row. And there was a moment in the wedding when I realized I was enjoying myself. And that moment was when I realized I was no longer planning a wedding and that I was actually at a wedding and giving an inaugural lecture is a bit similar to that. I've been mulling this over the last 2 weeks, and we're here now, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm starting to enjoy it now. Now, as I look around the room, I can see people who've done so much to help and encourage me and challenge me. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your support. Well, I've been an academic for 20 years, which I can't even believe I'm saying that sentence, but I've been an academic for 20 years, 17 of them here at Essex. And looking at you in the audience, I'm seeing my academic life flash before me, and it's mostly in a good way. Now, I spent much of those 20 years moving between disciplines, as Todd said in his introduction, between history, education, sociology, criminology. But I've always been following a passion to understand the interplay of gender, power, and social order. And I remember that was the rather pompous title that I gave the first ever lecture course I ever wrote, Gender, Power, and Social Order. But it's still there. It's the writing in the stick of rock, I suppose. So this means I've spent 20 years moving between past and present, between different audiences, between different disciplines. And it's that movement, that communication between different audiences, different disciplines, between past and present, which I've found kind of relies on the idea of translation. And it's translation that I want to take as my theme tonight. Now, we're all used to the idea that things get lost in translation, that messages or meanings get diminished when they move between languages or formats. And certainly things do get lost in translation when we're talking about translating academic research into television, and we can discuss those things. But tonight I want to concentrate on what we can gain, what we stand to gain through that translation. And I want to argue that good TV history not only enriches academic research, but also reminds us why we do it in the first place. But before I embark on that, I want to take a brief time to think about the nature of public history and where TV sits within that. Now, we live at a time of an unprecedented appetite for public history. So visits to heritage attractions are up. Membership of the National Trust now stands at 4 million, which is far larger than political parties. History festivals now operate alongside literary festivals and cultural festivals. There's a thing called the Chalk Valley History Festival, which is sponsored by the Daily Mail, which sells out regularly in the summer. Hundreds of people spend their weekends in historical reenactments. They spend their weekends as Vikings or Civil War fighters or Second World War strategists. And tracing our family histories has become our national pastime. And even kids have the bug. In gaming, for example, the most popular FPS, as I've learned to call them, FPS, first-person shooter games, reconstruct historical conflicts and battles. Now, much of this is set out in Jerome de Groot's recent book, Consuming History. So what's the appeal? What's going on here? Why are we consuming history in such volume and at such a rate? I think our love of public history is largely driven by our desire to place ourselves in the world. Who are we? How did our lives come to be the way they are? How could they be different? And the stories we tell about ourselves, our communities, our country define who we were, who we are, and who we want to be. And these stories are all the more crucial now because we in the West, at least, live in what many have called dehistoricized times. We're no longer rooted in traditional cultures and structures, so we're rather more free-floating, and so we're looking to the past, perhaps to anchor ourselves. I think our passion for public history is also driven by another desire, and that's, whether conscious or otherwise, a desire to escape the present, to lose ourselves in another time or culture. I think that's certainly what's going on with the reenactment people at the weekend. Sometimes we mourn the passing of worlds we've lost. Sometimes we are glad to have left those worlds behind. And that raises very interesting questions about antipathy and empathy that we might feel towards those who lived in the past. And I'm going to return to that theme of empathy quite a lot in the lecture. Now, TV history is just one part of this very rich landscape, if you like, of public history. And TV history itself has a history. Starting, as we'll see in a moment, with one man talking to a camera, but becoming ever more sophisticated ever since. And I found it very useful to look at that history when I was researching shop girls and servants, just to see how presenting styles had changed, how communication styles with audiences had changed, and it's quite dramatic. Let's have a look at some slides. So this is where I would say it begins. I'd invite you to suggest who that is. That's AJP Taylor, the original history man. No props, no gimmicks, just one academic in a bow tie, down the barrel of the camera, giving a TED talk of its day, really, and quite, if you ever watch those, they are unbelievable. Why do wars start? Why do they end? And it's worth noting, I think, that Taylor, AJP Taylor, had worked as a journalist earlier in his career, which helped him to do his own kind of translation of history for television. And he had several TV series spanning the 1950s and 70s. I have to say, I think one reason I was slightly freaked by giving a professorial lecture is because in my mind, that's what a professor looks like. and I don't really, I feel I quite look like that. Then the expert lecturer went outside. This is Kenneth Clark and his famous series Civilization, which started in 1969. And it offered grand narratives, big sweep arguments around the history of Western art, architecture, and culture. And here what's going on is that the expert presenter tells an overarching story by visiting, walking around, going to visit visually rich locations. It's the expert lecture on location, if you like. But the next thing that happens is that the presenter disappears for a time. We had archive-led and interview-led formats with a narrator but no central presenter. And a classic example is The World at War, 1973-4, which ran to 26 episodes, can you imagine, and was at the time the most expensive series ever made. It fed into broader kinds of people's history, you might call it, People's Century, which was made in 1999. Same format, interviews and narration and archive. But if we move into, say, the 1980s and 90s, you see three distinct areas of innovation. You see how many of these shows you recognise as I flag some more up. Three things happened: the rise of the celebrity presenter, the rise of historical reality TV, and the rise of audience participation. So, celebrity presenters really begin with Tony Robinson, always Baldrick to me. Time Team was a groundbreaking series, started in 1994. It ran for many, many seasons, and it broke new ground in lots of ways, not just archaeologically. It was presented not by an academic, but as we've said, by Tony Robinson, an actor. It introduced the idea of a team of experts, so it's not just one expert, it's a team of experts doing very hands-on history. It also plays on the idea of jeopardy, which becomes a kind of staple in this kind of program. Will they succeed in solving the mystery? Will they finish the dig before the bulldozers arrive and take up the land? So this celebrity-led format continues today with classically Who Do You Think You Are?, which is now in its 10th year and shows no sign of diminishing. And the idea there, of course, is that you use a celebrity's personal history to tell a wider social history. Many, many spin-offs, including this one here, The Secrets of the Workhouse, ITV. Historical reality TV, though, was another very distinctive genre that emerged in the 90s. The first example of that was the 1900 House. I didn't know if anyone saw that, but it was the idea of where you film an ordinary family or an ordinary group of people living in historical conditions. So it's like the Big Brother house, but with living under a set of historical stresses. And actually, interestingly, it predates Big Brother by a year. So the first reality TV show on British television, I believe, was the 1900 House. Many, many spin-offs again. Edwardian Country House, Victorian Farm, Edwardian Farm, Victorian Pharmacy, I believe, Turn Back Time, and the latest Secrets of the Castle with Ruth, Peter and Tom, who've kind of cornered that genre and absolutely made it their own. Now, the idea of empathy is central to that format. It's all about how ordinary people would feel about living in that situation. It's not about what an expert necessarily can tell you about that experience. The final innovation, I think, in the 90s and beyond in the early 2000s was the idea of audience participation, where the audience had to vote. And the audience got to vote for the Great Britons in 2002 and for restoration projects in 2003, so the public decide which building to save, and I think that's the swimming baths in Manchester that won that competition. So what you see here is a huge shift from expert opinion to audience opinion. It's a centering and it's an enfranchising of the audience, though of course that's got its limits. Now that didn't mean that the expert lecture on location went away, because other people took up that genre and made it their own. The men we see behind me here, but also the women who came in the early 2000s and carved out areas of their own as well. And all very different in style, but all adding a huge amount, I think, to public history. The other thing I must mention here is historical drama, because it's not a classic history documentary type programme, but you cannot rule out historical drama in a discussion of history on television. At the same time that AJP Taylor was giving those lectures in the 1950s, ITV were showing things like The Adventures of Robin Hood and The Adventures of Sir Lancelot, and really established historical drama as a staple of the evening schedule, leading us right up to Downton and Mr. Selfridge today. Now, this brief tour of TV history, and I hope you recognise some of those programmes there and those faces, reflects two major social shifts. The first is the fragmenting, dividing or sharing of expertise, and the second is the empowerment of audiences. And for me, both these shifts are about much wider social change, and both of them are positive. So like customers in the high street, like students in a university, like patients in the NHS, the opinions and preferences of TV audiences matter much more than they ever did. We're living in an age of the end user, the citizen consumer, and it's been created by large-scale social processes that historians and sociologists love to study. Changes in the changes in the divisions of labour, production and consumption, changing definitions of rights, trusts and authority. But it's also driven by something else, and that is a cultural revolution in communication. If you go back to TV audiences, we as TV audiences, have never had as much choice, as many channels. We've never had the ability to shape content in the way we have now, or indeed to create content, which is the way the future is looking with the internet crossovers with television. And anybody making programmes in these times has to cut their cloth accordingly. So how did all this play out in the making of Servants and Shopgirls? Now, at one level, both series worked as the expert lecture on location, but they also set out to share and distribute authority through interviews with other researchers or testimony from former servants, former shop workers, or their descendants. And that was a very definite part of the plan. Both were indebted to women presenters, whose faces I've put up there on a previous slide. Both were very mindful of the audience. From the outset, we wanted to reach out beyond the traditional history viewer, or traditional BBC Two history viewer, who tends to be older and tends to be male. And what we were trying to do was appeal to devotees of historical drama, Mr. Selfridge and Downton Abbey, for example, and also to fans of what might be called historical features programming, the history of the home, history of gardens, history of design, food, health, shops, clothes, the stuff, if you like, of everyday life. So what did we gain in translation through making Shopgirls and Servants? And I think we gained three things. I'll take you through those three things. First of all, we were able to tell hidden histories, to bring these two groups of workers into the historical frame. And let's start with servants. More people worked in domestic service than at its height, the end of the 19th century, than worked in any other single industry. That's quite a staggering fact. A lot of you in this theatre, if you're from Britain, will probably be descended from a servant. Now that's because servant keeping was extremely common. It wasn't confined to the grand country houses, but extended right down the social scale. And servant keeping is built into our everyday architecture, in the terracing, in Victorian terracing with the attics and the basements, in the side entrances of interwar semis. It's all around us. And anyone who could afford domestic help bought domestic help until well into the 1930s. So if it was so common and so ubiquitous, why had historians ignored them, and why had programme makers preferred to make master-servant drama rather than documentary? Now, I just need to be very clear, there are some very important exceptions here, not least the work of Leonor Davidoff, who sadly died a few weeks ago, and her research on servants, absolutely pioneering, and on other women workers, opened the way for so many others to help to address this neglect of servants. And I use that in my own work on, as Todd mentioned in the introduction, my own PhD was on almost like the use of domestic service as a rehab route for young offenders in the late 19th century. So what do you do with your bad girls? You round them up, put them in rescue homes and preventive homes, put a mop in their hand, train them to be domestic servants. But I think it's also, if you think about this neglect stems from two things. One is quite practical, in the sense that servants and indeed shop workers were privately employed. So any records of employment about how much they were paid or what they had to do are held in private hands. They're not necessarily archived, not commonly archived, so it's difficult to get to it. But there were also ideological obstacles. Servants, also shop workers, were seen by social historians, many of them anyway, as rather sellout workers who put up with poor working conditions instead of battling them. There's another thing, though. It's something to do with the nature of domestic service work itself, if we're talking about the neglect of servants. Now, anyone who does this knows this. Cooking, cleaning, washing, ironing, mending, polishing, caring creates no end product. The blazing fire, the clean sheets, the cooked meal, they're all very, very transitory. The work that goes into them at one point has to be repeated, often 2 or 3 times in the same day, and certainly the next day. So also this work has to be done invisibly. The good servant is one who works from behind the scenes but leaves no trace, literally wipes their own history from the record. So one of our challenges in the series was to put servants back into the historical frame by finding ways to visualise, crucially to visualise their invisible work. And some of the ways we did this will be familiar to academics and students here, through the diaries of servants and servant keepers, through interviews with former servants and their descendants, through the census, through statistics, so basically through texts and numbers so beloved of academics. But other ways in which we try to put them back in the frame will be a lot less familiar. And herein lies the magic of TV and the way it's conjured by creative experts behind the scenes, all of whom are translating history for television. Now, in a moment, I'm going to play the opening sequence of the 3rd episode of Servants. And I'm going to talk about some techniques for putting servants back in the frame and just see how many you can spot in the 2-minute clip that's coming up. One of the ways we put servants back in the frame was by substituting me for a servant. Now, by that, I don't mean taking on the domestic work, because it's not something I'm known for doing very well, nor did it involve me dressing in a maid's uniform, because that just wouldn't have worked at so many levels. But when I talk about substituting me for a servant, I mean allowing the camera to follow me. So the audience would have a servant's eye view of a country house or of a Victorian house, an Edwardian house. So through the servant staircases, through the tunnels, up to their rather Spartan living quarters. Another way we reconstructed it was by looking at elements of their daily work, feeling the weight of coal scuttles, imagining the bad smell of chamber pots, the good smell of baking bread. So it was through those kinds of techniques, through colour grading, capturing the dimness of servant quarters compared with the sumptuousness very often of the rest of the house. Through sound, the opening title music builds to a kind of a pitch. It's about the idea that change is coming and change is on its way. And in another clip, which I'm not showing, but we used Philip Glass's Einstein on the Beach, with the counting and the numbers going up to again count us going up the stairs, yet more stairs again. We use things like the clunk of a door closing, the heavy green baize door which separated the servant quarters from the rest of the house. And it's that clunk that is the dividing noise. We use disparate images, postcards of unknown servant portraits stuck to railings and street corners. And that invited the audience to think about, who were these people? Who were they? Will we ever know who they were and how they lived? Very bold graphics, opening graphics, kind of Banksy style, going over where a servant was painted really over the front of a house, so literally putting them back in the frame. Now I'm saying we here, this is very much the royal we, because I had absolutely nothing to do with that whatsoever. I was the text and numbers person. All this other, wonderful stuff was done by the creative team behind the scenes. And we were really trying to put the servant back in the frame in an absolutely sensory way. Sound, sight, smell, the weight of things, light, those kinds of things. It wasn't until I saw it in the final version, I think it was when we were doing voiceover, that and the hairs on my neck went up, and I was blown away by what we saw. So it was all made possible through this creation of these creative teams. Let's have a look at it now. Still does it. That's what I mean about what's to be gained, I think, from working with television, I think, on these kinds of things. If I'd done a lecture on that, it would never have had the same kind of effect. So program makers use all these kinds of sensory tactics to engage and hold viewers' attention, obviously, but they have another technique as well, which is engaging their emotions. And I know this is a contentious area, and I want to talk about it in this next section. In both series, we wanted to show how the story of domestic service and of shop work is an emotional one. So it wasn't a case of us imposing an emotional framework on a non-emotional history. It's a very emotional history. It's a case of drawing out the innate emotion within it. Again, making it visible, using different techniques to make it visible. It's a story of how people negotiate hierarchy, loyalty, and deference, but it's also about how they celebrate when they break through social orders and constraining social orders. So in both series, we wanted to trace those workers, those women workers primarily, their struggle for respect as workers, respect as women, and we wanted the audience to empathise with that struggle, or I certainly did. Now, stories of service and of shopping are incredibly intimate. They're very, very personal. They touch on incredibly personal things, how we organise our homes, how we keep clean, what we wear, what we eat, how we meet each other's needs, the interweaving of all kinds of desire, pleasure, and guilt. So, as I say, it's not a case of imposing an emotional framework on this story. It's an emotional story to start with. Our job was to really to bring it out. Now, one way to do that is by engaging contributors, by asking them the famous question, so how do you feel? How do you feel about that? Or how do you think that person would have felt in the past? It can seem hackneyed, but it's a very useful technique, and we can talk about that perhaps in the questions. Another way to do that, though, was for me as the presenter to build a very strong connection with the audience. And I had to learn to do that pretty quickly. I remember a very intense sort of 2-3 hour training session on camera work, because I'd never really done any of this kind of thing before, only been an interviewee on programs. So it was quite a step up. And I was expecting this training to be quite technical. I thought it would be about how to stand, which is probably, I'm doing it all wrong probably now, but don't hide behind a lectern. How to stand, how to walk, how to simplify and remember things. I thought it would be a kind of technical training. It turned out to be quite the opposite. It was all about emotion. It was all about what I wanted the audience to feel. And the trainer was an actor, and he was a director from RADA, and his message to me was very simple. If I wanted to get through to the audience, then I had to learn about what I wanted them to feel, not what I wanted them to learn. And that was a very, very big difference, and I think try and carry that into the lecture theatre with me now. So what did I want viewers to feel in any one moment? Could be all sorts of things. Could be shock, could be surprise, could be amusement, could be, I didn't know that, or isn't that awful? But some kind of emotional reaction. Shame, outrage. Now, in this next clip I'm going to show you, I'm standing in a country house, it's Brodsworth in Doncaster, as visitors walk around me. It's an English heritage property. And I suppose in the piece you're about to see, I'm reflecting on what I think they see, what they're seeing and what they're not seeing. And I suppose what the reaction I want to get from them is I'm challenging them to rethink what they think about when they go round a country house. The clip then feeds into a short section of the wonderful Margaret Powell, who was a former servant and became a celebrity in her own right in the 1960s as she wrote about her experiences of service, and her books became the part of the basis for Upstairs, Downstairs as a drama later on. So you see a little bit of Margaret Powell as well. But what I think about in this clip is the thing to think about is the emotional response and the emotional message. So this is from the middle of episode. I could watch that. I could watch so much more of that. That's coming in a minute. Right, we'll leave it there. Now, I think this is one of the things I really want to talk about tonight and see what you think in the questions. That a lot of people regard TV as manipulating emotions. It does. That's kind of what it does. It's also one of the keys to telling powerful stories and creating compelling narratives. And it's those stories and narratives which give our lives shape and meaning. They're the basis for empathy as well, the ability to reflect on our own lives and identify with others. Now, debates on empathy in history and social science are nothing new. They form a rich seam around which many, many disciplines are structured. They take us right back to the Enlightenment and old debates about the relationship between reason and sentiment. Philosopher David Hume famously went as far as to claim that morality itself is based on moral sentiment rather than abstracted reason. Social theorist Max Weber developed the concept of Verstehen as a way of capturing our need to understand, perceive, and grasp the world, to understand meanings intended or expressed by others. The historian R.G. Collingwood believed empathy to be the key to what he termed the historical imagination. Sociologist C. Wright Mills thought it similarly central to the sociological imagination. And today, psychologists see empathy as the bedrock of pro-social behaviour. So empathy is across the social sciences and the arts. And my message here is that we shouldn't confuse sentiment with sentimentality. We shouldn't confuse emotion and empathy with some kind of soft-soaked soft-heartedness. Rather, we should see them as underpinning sociability and morality. And of course, in a modern, multi-mediated world, TV and other media are going to play a major part in that. And this brings me to the third gain we make by translating history for television. It's to do with mass audience and reach and the opening up of dialogue. So in total, each episode of the two series, which have 3 episodes each episode attracted about 1 million viewers. Now, I'm used to writing books that maybe Todd was very kind about the number of books I'd written, but they don't reach that far, do they, compared to this kind of thing. These series were previewed, reviewed, discussed on radio and across print media. And they appeared in The Sun, in The Telegraph, in Grazia. There was a big debate about these kinds of topics across the media. The book that I co-wrote with exec producer and general TV genius Annabelle Hobley, who's sitting here, to accompany the Shop Girl series, that book is selling very well and it's going into paperback, which is lovely. I have to say it would make a great Christmas present if anyone's still it's still available, and we could even sign it tonight. Now, viewers don't just offer, and the viewers and our readers, we found, have had a very active dialogue with us. They're very upfront in putting us straight, putting us right on all sorts of points. Indeed, Annabelle is quite right to feel that the audience is on her shoulder as she edits. I would say that respect for the audience drives rigour in TV history, at least the kind of TV history that I've been lucky enough to be involved with. Now, viewers don't just offer us corrections, they also offer us news stories, access to their own archives. They also tweet all the way through transmission, which is quite interesting. And they can tweet about extremely strange things. One of my favourites was the second episode of Shop Girls. Loving tonight's episode. Can you settle a bet in our house? How tall are you? and so on. Now, in my experience, the TV audience is very, very willing to be part of a conversation on all kinds of issues. And that brings me to the final part of what I want to say tonight. What I've tried to show is how translating history for TV itself has changed. It's got its own history. And we've seen two significant shifts, the sharing of expertise and the centering of the audience. I've also argued throughout, I think, that academic history doesn't have to be and isn't dumbed down by TV. It doesn't have to lose quality in translation, but actually stands to make substantive gains from the process. And I've identified three specific gains: TV's power as a visual medium, its power for emotional engagement, and its power to command a truly mass audience. Now, central to all of those three, again, is empathy. Now, it's a very common criticism that's often levelled at TV and other visual media that despite their capacity to generate empathy, they actually encourage public passivity and indifference. So despite all these emotions being, drummed up in us, actually it leaves us passive and indifferent. So we're not an empowered audience after all, we're a passive audience. So I want to try and address this point as my final point. So many commentators argue that modern media whip up empathy and then waste it. Now, I'm not sure there's ever such a thing as wasted empathy, but let's put that aside for a second. Susan Sontag argues in a classic piece on documentary photography that atrocity photographs reduce suffering to a spectacle. So they open up pictures of suffering to a wide audience, but they reduce it to a spectacle. Michael Ignatieff argues in a piece on ethics and television that TV does create moral causes, but that their shelf life, as he puts it, is brutally short. He goes on to say that presenters asking how people feel often serves to only emphasize the distance between the viewer and the subjects of the program, pointing to, as he puts it, a chasm that empathy cannot hope to cross. So empathy is bunk, potentially in this view. Similarly, Bauman argues that although we may feel empathy for strangers on screen, this will always be empathy at a safe distance. Suffering on the glass screen always remains firmly behind the glass screen. And this really raises the question as to what TV could or should, TV history could or should, do with the empathy that it generates, especially around past suffering. Now, audiences may well empathise with a celebrity's workhouse ancestor, but do they empathise with people queuing for food banks in today's society? Are they willing to extend that empathy in that way? Are they willing to bridge past and present? Now, it's asking a lot for a TV programme to channel empathy into social change. From the outset, the BBC's founding mission, if you like, still is its mission, is to inform, educate and entertain. It's not social revolution in its mission statement. Other companies simply seeking to turn a profit and entertain. And we ought, of course, to allow art to be made simply for art's sake. But if we want TV to help to effect social change, I think we need to recognise that this is a shared responsibility. Many, many others have their part to play. Political parties, corporations, communities, church groups, faith groups, professors and others in universities would all have their part to play in effecting social change. If we want TV to contribute to social justice, we need to undertake another set of translations and develop dialogues with groups of the kind I've just mentioned. Now, as Todd said in his introduction, I've been involved over the past few weeks in a campaign for a new working women's charter. I won't go into that now because we're very near the end of this talk, but there's plenty on that on TEDx and on the website if you want to have a look at that. But safe to say, 40 years ago, second wave feminists drew up a working women's charter which listed 10 points that they thought needed to change to deliver equality. In the TEDx talk I did recently, I argued we've only reached 4 out of 10 of those in 40 years. And so both of these series for me are really about what are the kind of factors which have prevented a better success rate, you might say. Now, the campaign for the Working Women's Charter, for me, was inspired directly by the Shop Girls research. It came directly out of it. In researching the final episode and the final chapters of the book, I came across the Women's Charter from 1974, and I'm quite intrigued by it. It didn't make it into the TV series. It did make it into the book briefly. Now, I was looking at it because I needed to bring the story up to date. And the story of retail, when you bring it up to date, is not a happy one. It doesn't make for a happy ending. So retail is the UK's largest private sector employer. 2/3 of its 2.7 million workers are women. Most of them are working on part-time or flexible contracts and on very low pay. So it's very difficult to frame that into an upbeat ending for a history of shop work. Now, my final clip, it's only a minute long, it features an interview from the closing sequences of Shop Girls, and it's with a group of women workers currently working in a store. But they're not employed by Mr. Selfridge, they're employed by Mr. Sainsbury, and they have a particular story to tell. Okay. I should say, I don't know if you saw this show, if you remember it, but this is the Sainsbury's where I used to work on the checkouts as an 18-year-old. And some of the people in this group I do remember, and they did remember me. Now, the women in that clip are quite upbeat about their work. They work for a broadly decent employer, Sainsbury's, although not one that yet pays a living wage. But many of them undertake that kind of work because for them it's still the only way they can juggle caring responsibilities of children and elderly parents and so on. And that all too common scenario is one of the major factors contributing to gender inequality today, 40 years on from the efforts of second wave feminists to combat it. Now, our campaign for a new Working Women's Charter is beginning to gather a little bit of momentum. We had some Guardian coverage a couple of weeks ago. We're going to organise an online petition. We're joining up with TUC and Fawcett Society and other gender-based organisations to try and gather some momentum before the 2015 election to put some of these concerns firmly on the map, not least because women often hold the balance of power as swing voters in the election. Now, it may come to nothing. It may wither on the vine, but I raise it here as an example, a small example of how it might be possible to channel the kind of empathy generated by a TV series, in this case the empathy for the challenges facing women workers in the past and the present, could channel that empathy into more direct calls for social justice and social change. So to draw this to a close, as academics, the academics of you who are here, we can and need to define this kind of activity as impact, academic impact. But there's got to be more to it than that. And that phrase itself can be quite a deadening one. For me, all this is actually not about impact itself. It's about activism. It's about a very direct kind of politically driven social history, a very politically driven public sociology, public history, even if you want to call it public service. So like the making of TV history, the making of connections across disciplines, that kind of work depends on the power of communication, the power of storytelling, and above all, it depends on the power of translation. Thank you very much. Thank you.